Welcome to this webinar about the key legal sustainability updates within the European Union. We will focus on European Union. We all know that there is enough to talk about in our region here. My name is Karin Ekberg and I'm the CEO of Leadership and Sustainability. We have our 10 years anniversary this year. We work as consultants in the strategy area, but also as verifiers and auditors and trainers for several different programs. And with me today, I have Janne. Janne, would you like to say a few words about yourself, please?
Yes. Hi, everyone. My name is Janne. I'm Sustainability Manager at Leadership and Sustainability, and I'm working here now around 5.5 years. I'm part of the strategy team, and I'm working with customers on various sustainability projects, and amongst others, on legal action planning, legal reviews, and supporting implementations to be compliant with those legal regulations.
Thank you, Janne. So before we start with the actual content of the webinar, let me have this standard slide here about some basics of the Zoom webinar platform. You are all muted during the webinar in order to ensure that we have a good audio quality. But please feel free to send us any questions during the presentation, and please do that via the question function. So on the right-hand side on this slide, you can see a screenshot of the webinar window, and you can find the icon to open the Q&A window in the bar at the bottom. And here you can type in your question and send it to us, and we will reply to your questions then at the end of the session at the very latest, because we will have a Q&A session towards the end. And after today's session, we will provide you with a link to download the presentation and also the recording. So the agenda for today, we will give you an update about the EU Green Deal and how it is actually moving over to become more of a clean industrial deal now. We will talk about some of the EU sustainability directives, and then we will talk about business implications and strategic actions. There is quite a lot of information we will try to hand over to you today. But stay tuned, a lot is marked up in the slides as well. And then we will have a live Q&A session towards the end. So please be prepared with your questions. It's your opportunity to ask your questions today. So now the EU Green Deal, it is actually moving over to become the Clean Industrial Deal. And if we look at the EU Green Deal, it was introduced with the aim to achieve climate neutrality, to achieve a circular economy, and to introduce a strategy for sustainable and circular textiles. There exists the legally anchored goal of achieving climate neutrality by 2050. And that is then with measures being mandatory for all member states, and the progress being published in the Climate Action Progress Report 2023. And I guess there will be future reports as well moving on. And in order to reach the goal of setting up a circular economy, the EU plans to introduce several regulations. The eco-design for sustainable products regulation, and the EU strategy for textiles, a chemical strategy, the right to repair, as well as the packaging and the packaging waste regulation. And these regulations shall have an impact on waste reduction, as well as improving and closing product value chains. The overall strategy for sustainable and circular textiles, it aims to create a more environmentally friendly, competitive textile sector with greater resilience to global disruptions. It is focusing on waste with the Waste Framework Directive, the extended producer responsibility, and the packaging and packaging waste regulation. It is also impacting eco-design with the eco-design for sustainable products regulation, the ESPR, and has an effect on the product communication with the digital product passport, which is a chapter of the ESPR. So it's not a standalone directive, it's really one chapter within the ESPR. And then we also will be influencing the communication with empowering consumers for the Green Transition Directive. As we can see, the strategy is really broad and has an impact on many different key areas for your textile business. And now we also see the simplification shift. I'm sure that many of you have heard about the different decisions of the Commission, about the omnibus, for example, and moving over then to this clean industrial deal. So the Clean Industrial Deal, it pursues the goal of uniting climate ambitions and economic competitiveness within the framework of this overarching growth strategy. At the center is the transformation of industry toward a lower emission and at the same time internationally competitive form of production. And compared to the original Green Deal, there is a clear shift in content. And I think that is what perhaps has been worrying many of us over the past months. While the Green Deal also focused on, for example, biodiversity and resource consumption, the Clean Industrial Deal focuses primarily on decarbonization as the central prerequisite for a sustainable industrial future. And so along this road, there is also discussion about a weakening of certain sustainability rules. We will talk more in detail about that a bit later, in order to create space for investments and adaptability without losing sight of the overarching environmental goals. We hear a lot of reducing the administrative burden, etc. And then particular attention is placed on supporting European production. Location conditions are to be improved, bureaucratic hurdles reduced, and above all, energy prices are brought into focus as well. The latter are considered a decisive factor for the international competitiveness of the industry. So the Clean Industrial Deal therefore represents an industrial policy reorientation that claims to combine climate protection, economic strength, and Europe's strategic sovereignty. So the Parliament, the European Union Parliament and the Commission, they are now moving back and forth about what some of the details will be in some of the directives, but there are also some of the directives that have already been approved, let's say, and that are not changing. However, there may be implementation acts that are still remaining to be written and to be defined, which means that there can be further changes even in the directives that have already been approved. If we move on here, on this slide, we summarized which regulations and directives that are for now not simplified and which will probably be simplified. And with the note that this is a process and not yet set in stone. So for example, I believe it was 4 weeks ago, more or less, the Parliament took a decision regarding the omnibus and passed a decision there. But that decision has not yet been confirmed by the Commission. So we are waiting for the decision of the Commission, the final decision from the Commission. Perhaps it will come towards the end of this year. That is what has been scheduled so far, but we will see. And so here is a list now of the regulations that are not being simplified. And this is the Eco-Design for Sustainable Product Regulation, the ESPR. But as I said, the implementation directives are not yet available. Then we have the Empowering Consumers for the Green Transition. We have the Forced Labor Regulation. We have the PFAS restriction. And we have the Right to Repair Directive. With the current focus of electronics and textiles the relation to textiles has not been defined yet. But this may be connected also to the ESPR. We have the Textile Labeling Regulation. We have the Waste Framework Directive, and we have the Product Packaging and Waste Regulation as well. So these are the ones that are standfast, let's say, that have been approved already. And then if we move on now to the regulations that might be simplified, as it has been proposed by the Parliament. And this is a big cornerstone. This is the CSRD, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, and it has been under discussion for a long time. It has been debated locally in several countries and at European Union level that the CSRD would mean a significant administration burden to many companies, because according to the CSRD, you're supposed to report on all material topics, but it may be up to over 1,000 indicators according to the CSRD. So the final decision here is not yet confirmed, but probably the scope of businesses affected by the CSRD will be reduced, and the limit will be increased. So probably there will be a threshold of 1,750 employees and a revenue of 450 million. And then we have another also big cornerstone, and this is the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. And this is about making sure that your supply chain is compliant with international standards regarding environmental standards, but also, of course, working conditions. And this directive has also been discussed for a while now, and it will probably only be mandatory for companies with 5,000 employees and revenues of about 1.5 billion euro. Furthermore, we have the EU taxonomy. It will be aligned with CSRD and the reporting reduction for non-financial companies. And one directive, the Green Claims Directive, was actually withdrawn for the time being by the European Commission. So there are no ongoing negotiations right now about the Green Claims Directive. It has now the status on hold. We have the EU deforestation regulation. It has been postponed to 2026, so it is not on hold or so, but the implementation timeline has been moved out a bit. And then we also have the REACH revision, and there will be a simplification introduced, perhaps even towards the end of this year. So here you see it's a high-level overview, but I hope that it helps you in understanding where you still should continue your work and where perhaps you are now falling out, let's say, of one or two scopes. And then if we look at the timeline for your business now for the next 3 years, the regulatory landscape, as we all know, of the European Union, it is really complex. And therefore, we think it might be helpful to look at a 3 years timeline for your business, for you to know which regulations you should start to prepare now and in 2026. And I must say, this is not a totally comprehensive list that I will be showing you. We have not included everything that relates to sustainability, but at least it gives you some of the important milestones. So in 2026, there will be some information rules you need to add on your new packaging to comply with the basic PPWR requirements. Then the Empowering Consumers Directive comes into place, as well as the deforestation regulation and the waste shipment regulation. And then furthermore, although it's not yet taking effect, the delegated acts for the digital product passport will be defined, and they will help you prepare for the digital product passport. We see this as one of the directives. I mean, it's not a standalone directive, but one of the regulations that need a very long time to prepare for, because you really need to know your supply chain upstreams in order to be able to give the information that is requested according to the DPP. In 2027, there will also be material composition rules you need to comply with. There will be the ESPR with the DPP, which will come into effect then. and large businesses will have to report under CSRD. So currently the proposal is 1,750 employees and a 450 million euro threshold. And in the third year, in 2028, we are talking about the design for recycling rules that will come into effect. Large corporations will need to comply with the CSDDD, the due diligence directive, and the extended producer responsibility will be mandatory, as well as the forced labor regulation. And then again, we also have the CSRD for wave 3 companies, so for additional companies that will be having to report there. So this was a bit of a milestone overview for you. But now I would also like to go and talk a bit about some more directives into a bit more detail. So let me go there. I will start with the packaging and packaging waste regulation, and this is the PPWR. I know it's a horrible number of acronyms, but the packaging and packaging waste regulation, it will, as you have seen in the timeline, introduce new rules for your packaging over the next years. It aims to minimize packaging waste, reduce the use of primary raw materials, and promote a transition to a circular, sustainable economy. It will apply to all packaging, regardless of the material used, and to all packaging waste. In Q2 2026, you will already need to comply with some basic rules. And the key documentation covers a packaging inventory containing the material data, quantities, and recyclability attributes. And from 2026 on, an identification and contact details of the producer and importer must be indicated on the packaging. A QR code need to be added to the packaging. And then from 2028, the packaging must indicate the material composition, compostability, recycled content, and reusability. And from 2030 onwards, there exists a rule of a minimum of 70% recyclable materials in packaging. And the weight and volume of packaging must be reduced to the minimum necessary for functionality. And after 2030, there will be an expansion of material and recyclability rules. And now let's move then to the Eco-Design for Sustainable Products regulation, the ESPR. So it establishes a framework for setting eco-design requirements for products, requiring both compliance with sustainability criteria and the provision of product information through the digital product passport. So it's really twofold. One, you need to have design guidelines where you follow several different criteria. And the other one is that you need to make information available on your product or via a barcode or something that you can scan, so that the consumer can get a lot of different information about your supply chain and about your product. And it applies to almost all physical products placed on the EU market, with a few exemptions. But then they have also prioritized the product groups to be in the pipeline. And among others, textiles are a prioritized group. And in 2027, 2028, first DPP rules will come into effect, while in July 2026, reporting obligation on discarded goods will start. But as I said, the delegated acts will be published next year, and there are probably several delegated acts where you will learn more about the exact design guidelines, but also the criteria and the indicators that should be reported on the product. And then let me briefly summarize the requirements which are expected under the ESPR. So we don't know what the final requirements will be, but there are of course some suggestions. So it would be related to circularity and product design rules, that products must meet criteria for durability, reusability, upgradability, repairability. Then compliance and enforcement requirements, that companies must demonstrate compliance with eco-design criteria. Destruction of unsold products requirements. We all know there has been a lot of debate about some brands who are destroying unsold products in quite significant volumes. And companies must prevent the destruction of unsold consumer products. And a direct ban applies to unsold textiles and footwear, with exemptions only for small companies and a certain transition period for medium-sized companies. And then we have the product information and traceability rules. So companies must provide full product information, including a DPP, a digital product passport, for transparency and traceability. So, and the digital product passport, it is a crucial element of the ESPR. So as I said, it's not a standalone directive, it's one chapter in the ESPR. And the specific DPP data requirements and technical standards, they are still under development. And the European Commission is expected to adopt the first delegated acts sometime in 2026, and perhaps even the last ones even in 2027. And therefore, the regulations comes into effect then around 2027, 2028. And the full implementation of the digital product passport across all product categories is anticipated to be completed by July 19, 2030. So basically, they will be phasing in product group by product group until by mid-2030, all product groups are included in the scope. And as I mentioned already, the textiles sector is a prioritized product category group. And now the expected data requirements for the DPP. And again, this is only an expectation. We don't know yet, but here we have some ideas. The product identity, the brand category, production batch, material composition, the percentage of a fiber type and weight of the components, sustainability attributes, greenhouse gas footprint, durability score, also substances of concern, declaration of restricted substances. We have repairability and end of life, perhaps availability of spare parts, recycling and take-back options, and we also have recyclability, so perhaps a percentage of recycled materials and recovery of materials and a recyclability score. So we think that especially the ESPR with the DPP is a key regulation. So we encourage you to review and monitor it carefully. And with that, I will now hand over to Janne, who will now move forward with the Waste Framework Directive.
Thank you, Karin. Thanks. Yes, so the Waste Framework Directive, including the extended producer responsibility, is focusing on the end of life of your product. So it has, in the end, implications, I'd say, on your product design, on your product management, and how you treat also the packaging. The key goal is that companies should minimize environmental impacts by prioritizing waste prevention and providing clear guidance on proper disposal. And for that, member states must implement extended producer responsibility schemes for end-of-life products that promote reuse and recycling. It will apply to companies with over 250 employees, and companies need to comply with the Waste Framework Directive by 2028. Member states of the EU need to introduce their own EPR schemes in the following years. And I say the crucial or the complex thing here is that for now, each EU member state will introduce its own EPR scheme. That will make it quite complex for businesses to track all the different EPR schemes. But before discussing that further, I will also go over the key documentation that will be needed to comply with the regulation. So in the end, to comply with the upcoming EPR requirements, companies will first need to demonstrate that they are properly registered with the Producer Responsibility Organization or that they operate an approved self-managed system. So in the end, either you register on this official site or you manage a self-managed system, which is really complex. So in the end, what we expect is that the member states will introduce their PROs and then you have to register with them. In the end, when you register, you also will need to be able to provide detailed product data. At a minimum, this will include annual sales volumes broken down by product type and material, as well as figures on products collected each year and any unsold items. And one goal or one thing that will happen through these EPRs is the financial contribution will become mandatory under the EPR framework. This means companies should already start keeping clear records of any EPRs fees already paying. At this stage, however, it is important to know that no official fee structures have been published yet. So we know a fee structure will come up in the EU member states, but not yet how it's structured. But as we know, for example, France already has an EPR scheme, for example, and other countries as well. And what we also know is that EPR schemes will be coming, and it is really important to track the movement here. So what we expect in the future is that, in best case, this fee structure will be synchronized between the states, because for now, with this directive, each member state could have another fee structure, but the EU is aiming to synchronize that. Yes. And then coming to the deforestation-free products regulation, and this regulation has more implications on your supply chain. So as you have seen with Karen giving us an overview of the other regulations, it's really, we have some regulations covering your product, the end of life of your product, the packaging, the information of your product, but also the supply chain. So the goal of this regulation is to ensure that certain commodities, like for example cattle or rubber, sold or exported in the EU are not linked to deforestation or forest degradation. Any operator or trader who places the commodities covered under the regulation on the EU market or exports from it must be able to prove that the products do not originate from recently deforested land or have contributed to forest degradation. The previous start of this mandatory reporting was planned for the end of this year, of 2025, for small and medium enterprises, but it was pushed back to the end of 2026. So it gives a bit of more time to prepare everything around that. Because the key documentation which will be required are geographic coordinates of production sites, supply chain traceability needs to be set up, a proof of compliance with local land laws, and due diligence reports will be required. So you can see in the end, you really have to have transparent overview of your supply chain, and that's quite complex, as we all know. And this is also linked to the next regulation that we shortly wanted to cover, which is the EU forced labor regulation. This also is especially having impacts on your supply chain traceability and transparency. The EU forced labor regulation aims to prohibit the import, sale, and export of products made with forced labor within the EU market. Businesses must ensure their supply chains are free from forced labor practices, as non-compliance may result in products being banned from the EU market. And this applies to all products for which forced labor was used at any stage of production, regardless of the country of origin or whether the product is supplied domestically or imported. The first reporting period will start in 2027. And as you can see from the scope of applicability, it really covers your whole supply chain, beginning with Tier 4, Tier 3, Tier 2, Tier 1. That is what is aimed by this regulation. It will be expected that companies have available supply chain records with product and supplier details, due diligence and risk assessment records. And in addition to that, companies need to provide this information to authorities during investigations. So it is not that you have to have all this information and already give it to the authority, but it's more of an investigation type. So the authority could come and say, okay, we want to check this brand regarding forced labor. So all in all, economic operators must implement due diligence measures to identify, prevent, mitigate, or remediate forced labor risks in their supply chain. It is important to document all measures taken, to conduct risk assessments, audits, supplier communications, and remediation steps. And I think we would recommend to start with the risk assessment to identify those suppliers with highest forced labor risks and implement actions there first, because we all know there are extremely complex global supply chains, and knowing each and every supplier is not yet possible. That's why this risk-based approach we think is a good first step. And as I've already mentioned, economic operators must provide information and documentation upon request and must respond to preliminary and formal investigations and cooperate with customs and national authorities. And one good thing is that the EU said that they will offer small and medium enterprises with support by providing, for example, guidelines and contact to reduce administrative burden for the SMEs. But the details about the support is not yet clarified, but there will be something coming up to reduce the administrative burden again for SMEs. Now, I think that's the last directive that we wanted to cover in a bit of more detail. And I think the Empowering Consumer Directive is a bit more holistic. In the end, it has implications on your communication around sustainability. And in the end, if you want to talk about sustainability, then this means you also have to work on your products as well as your supply chain. The Empowering Consumers for the Green Transition Directive strengthens consumer rights and empowers consumers to make informed, confident, and effective purchasing decisions by ensuring transparency, fairness, and access to reliable information. This directive applies to all businesses when offering goods or services. And this directive will already need to be implemented by companies in Q3 of 2026, so already next year. And key documentation is evidence supporting environmental claims. Sustainability labels must be backed by certifications, and proof of consumer information transparency is a requirement. On this slide, we have now summarized the requirements by showing you what, in best case, you implement when making environmental claims and what you, in best case, should avoid. All claims must be scientifically substantiated. All claims must be specific and precise. And for claims about climate impact, it must be indicated whether greenhouse gas emissions are offset elsewhere. And the following claims should be avoided. Sustainability labels without a certification scheme. So in the end, labels just saying it's green or environmental friendly without a certification scheme behind are prohibited. Also, general or vague environmental claims that cannot be substantiated are not allowed. And environmental claims based on a false reference point should not be made. So for example, let's say a product has a very low greenhouse gas impact, but the water consumption is extremely high. So then this low greenhouse gas impact is not allowed to be advertised, because for the consumer, it's not obvious that the choice is not more sustainable because other environmental parts are harmed with this product. Then advertising based on the offsetting of greenhouse gas emissions is not allowed. And in the end, all in all, social washing and greenwashing is not allowed, with the goal to empower consumers to make informed choices in their consumption and to avoid misleading information. Because as we all know, if you go into into a store currently, you see a lot of claims being made without being sure how precise it is. And that shall be changed with this directive. Yes, so I think what we have seen is that legislations for textiles span the entire life cycle, from supply chains in the beginning to end of life of your products. That means there are a lot of things in the pipeline for your business. So your supply chains are covered, the end of life of your products, the packaging of your products, the information that you have about your products. And this is why we would like to take a few minutes to discuss the most important business implications and some first possible strategic actions you could take. And maybe just to say that in advance. There are a lot of different strategic steps that should be taken, and we cannot cover all of them in this session. It's more of a first idea. One thing that we definitely recommend is you need to prepare early on. So as you've seen, there's a lot of things coming up and preparation is key. There are several product implications which have a major impact on product as well as packaging design. And next to these, there also data frameworks are a key requirement or a key implication that comes up for your business. On the one hand, needing data on material composition and product performance, for example. And on the other hand, data needed for supply chain transparency and traceability. And to just visualize this with the product and packaging waste regulation and the waste framework directive have an impact on product implications as well as data frameworks. The deforestation and forced labor regulation are focusing on data frameworks related to the supply chain transparency and traceability, while the Empowering Consumers Directive and especially the Eco Design for Sustainable Product Regulations with the DPP do have a wide range of implications, covering like all those parts that you see on this slide. So in the end, with this slide, we think one really important thing gets visible. We should try not to review each and every regulation in isolation, but connect them and approach them systematically. Because if you've seen like this huge list of regulations coming up for your business, if you just review them one by one, it gets really overwhelming. But if you start to connect the dots and understand, okay, there are some regulations with product implications. Then we have others with supply chain transparency and traceability implications. And these, we can use them, for example, for the ESPR again, so that you should really try to have a systematic approach, I think, on those regulations. And how this systematic approach could look like, we would like to review just two exemplary possible roadmaps. And the first one focuses on supply chain transparency and traceability for the forced labor and the deforestation-free regulation. And here we really want to show you like the steps that you could take. Now, in best case, you did already start this year, or you start in early 2026, for example, with the risk assessments of your products and also with reviewing the geographics you source from. In the next step, you should then map your supply chain, and for that, probably even select a tool because it's really complex and tools can really simplify that. And we also recommend that next year you start with preparing policies, collect data, and implement mechanisms to comply with the regulations. And with the benefit that this build-up supply chain traceability will also feed into all other data frameworks. So if you prepare for that, you can use quite a lot of the information for the other regulations. So the roadmap to data frameworks is really crucial, especially for the digital product passport. We recommend to start as soon as possible by conducting a readiness check. So you should try to understand your current data status. And we think this readiness check will just be helpful to set up a pilot phase. Within this pilot phase that we recommend to work with, you can then start data collection and set up a trial framework. We know the DPP is not yet finalized, but this trial and pilot phase will help to set up robust data frameworks, but it should also always leave room for flexibility to adapt to the regulation updates. And again, here, it's also if you go into this pilot phase, you could do a try and error round with, do we have the resources in-house? Do we need a software for that as well? And so on. And yes, the execution of the DPP pilots will also be really time consuming and will require feedback loops. So it will be an ongoing process. And in best case, you can then, based on the DPP pilot, scale up the DPP for product groups. As you can see, even though the DPP rules will only apply in the future and not already now or next year, you should start working on that, as now is the time for trial and error rounds. So now you can make mistakes and understand, okay, I don't have data on this data point and so on. So we really encourage you to start with that. Yes. And in the end of our session, or before we go into the Q&A session, we would like to summarize the Sustainability Outlook 2026 from a regulation perspective, so for the next year. So we see that early resource and responsibility allocation will be required in order to be able to manage these major implications. So this should be done in the next month invest case so that you really know who is in charge and how you approach it. Setting up data frameworks and starting with pilot projects will be crucial and probably a focus of the upcoming year. And next year, your business already has to implement a few regulations, as Karen has shown you just in the beginning of this session. You need to comply with the information rules of the product and packaging waste regulation. The Empowering Consumers Directive will come into effect, as well as the deforestation and the waste shipment regulation. So already some regulations to comply with next year. And eventually, next year, we think you should also continue to track regulations on a regular basis, as we have all seen that there are simplifications and adaptations, as well as new regulations are being introduced. So it's a dynamic situation, and we really encourage you to track that dynamic situation and to be prepared for everything that comes. And we are really confident that with a good systematic approach, you can go ahead with that, and it can even give you the opportunity to review your strategies and to improve yourself.
So leadership and sustainability, we are celebrating 10 years this year, and we are now around 80 people globally. We have offices in several countries, but also teams in other countries. So for example, in Turkey, in China, in India, in Vietnam, in Bangladesh, in Pakistan, in Indonesia, in Turkey, I already mentioned, in Portugal, etc. And of course, our headquarters is based here in Germany with our central team here. And we do a lot of work in the supply chain. So we work a lot with the Cascade programs, the HIG FEM, the HIG FSLM. We are doing more and more FDM, the Facility Data Management assessments as well. We do Manufacturers Climate Action Program with Cascade, and we are also now doing cradle-to-cradle assessments. On the chemical side, we work a lot with the zero discharge of hazardous chemicals, and we offer all their services there. But we also help write handbooks and evaluate supply chain management programs or develop supply chain management programs together with our clients. And you can see also the countries where we are active. You can see at the very bottom of this slide. On the strategy side, so we have really divided our services into supply chain and into strategy services. And so we work a lot with the different regulations that we were just talking about. For example, we have conducted a lot of materiality assessments, and based on those materiality assessments, we usually work with our clients to develop their sustainability strategies together with them, of course. They're long-term strategies ranging 3 to 5 to 7 years into the future. And very often we also continue and then support our clients with writing their sustainability reports and doing other implementation projects together with them. And so we have a long experience in this sector, and also, but we have also experience from other sectors. And I think that's good to have some cross-reference to other sectors as well. We do a lot of services in the climate action area. So we do carbon footprinting, we do greenhouse gas verification, we develop climate strategies and also action plans, implementation plans, and decarbonization plans. And then we have an e-learning platform. We are really proud of that e-learning platform. We can deliver courses for you, tailor-made courses on our e-learning platform. And of course, we can also deliver face-to-face trainings. And then we have some other verifications and assurance services. So with the Cascade brand and retail module, for example.
Karen, may I read out a question to you that I think you can answer quite good?
Yes, I see it here. I can, into adoptions instead of having them for supplies.
I think that's a great question, and a
Yeah,
question that many suppliers
Yeah, so let us read this out. Do you think there will be a bigger convergence into adoption of specific standards instead of having many standards? For suppliers, having to follow multiple standards requested by brands is a big burden. Yes, we see that. We see that the number of standards that suppliers have to certify against according to their brand's needs has been increasing. There is a lot of discussion about audit fatigue in the sector, but also in other sectors, of course. I hope that there will be a convergence. And there are several efforts, for example, the Apparel Alliance with Cascade and ZTHC and some other organizations. They are working on trying to consolidate the tools, making sure they are aligned. And we see, for example, that if you look at the HIG facility environmental module, the chemical section there is really very much aligned with the zero discharge of hazardous chemicals program. So that is, I think, a benefit. And from another perspective, what we see as well is that even though perhaps the number of certifications is not being reduced, and all of these different players, they have their own business model and wish to stay in business. But what we see is also that more and more standards, they are acknowledging and accepting other standards. So, for example, with a cradle-to-cradle standard, the cradle-to-cradle assessment is quite a comprehensive assessment and is really focused on the circularity in a very holistic way. But the cradle-to-cradle actually accepts many of the SLCP, FSLM components, also the FEM components, and many other standards as well, the Oekotex standards, etc. So I think it's not only about reducing the number, but making a certain certification easier by using elements from other standards and accepting elements from other standards. So that is all I can say. We don't know. We will know more in 5 years or even 10 years from now. But it's a great question and a really, really important question. Yeah. Okay. Any other question or comment? No? Yeah. How will we know which standards will be accepted by the European Union government? And the legislation that we have within the EU doesn't usually tell you how to solve the problems or how to work on it. So it puts forward the standards, and it tells you what type of due diligence you need to have, but it doesn't tell you how to do it. So I don't see that the European Union will be, approving different standards really. And if they would do so, they would approve many standards at the same time, because they probably don't want to, let's say, disrupt the market by basically giving approval to a certain standard. So that's all I can say at this moment. Thank you so much for all your good questions, my friend. Yeah, great. Any other question? Great. So thank you so much for joining this webinar, and thank you so much to many of you who are joining so many of our webinars. It's really, really nice to see people we know, some people we don't know perhaps, and that you're coming back to our webinars, and it has been a pleasure to speak to you today. And please feel free to reach out to us. On the last slide, you see here our contact details. And of course, you will receive via an email from us within the next few days. You will receive the presentation deck and also the recording. Thank you.
Have a great rest of the day. Goodbye.
Goodbye.